In mid-2021, virtually every country in the world experienced what became the greatest global hyperinflation in history. The United States recorded a 40-year high inflation rate of 9.1% in June 2022, the highest ever recorded in the country. The inflation has caused an increase in the cost of living, and the world is changing and evolving at the same time. Many employees have seen firsthand that wages have not kept up with these rising costs. Increased margins and bumper profits have not gone ignored. A new revolution known as greedflation is beginning to surface. Financial mongols are brainstorming theories of how this phenomenon might eventually end capitalism in the US. Economists are arguing over whether monopolistic corporations are in fact increasing inflation in ways that contradict conventional theories. Politicians have used inflation to advance their preferred narrative about what went wrong and what measures would be necessary to bring price levels back on track ever since they started increasing a year ago. For more than a year, businesses in the US and throughout the world have been battling persistent hyperinflation. Despite the skyrocketing prices, these businesses still manage to create record profits. With $16.1 trillion in revenue, the Fortune 500 firms alone produced an all-time high of $1.8 trillion in profits. According to research, S&P 500 CEOs received an average income of $18.3 million in 2021, which is 324 times the typical worker's salary and greater than the pay ratio for both 2020 and 2019. In 2021, a year that was severely hampered by the pandemic and inflation, CEOs were quick to place the blame for price hikes on the pandemic, hyperinflation, and rises in employee wages. Yet, some analysis reveals that after accounting for inflation, employees' real pay decreased by 2.4% in 2021. Shockingly, S&P 500 CEO pay was up by 21% in 2022. Despite reports of hyperinflation in the US, many companies have been making profits, and CEOs have been well compensated. This translates to higher company profits and higher CEO compensation, but lower real employee salaries. Context: business earnings are rising, CEO pay is increasing, and costs and prices are also rising. But what about actual employee salaries? Well, that's the only thing that's going down. It was revealed that UK grocery prices increased 17.5% in March compared to the same month of the previous year. Back in December, egg prices in the US completely shot through the roof. Egg producers attributed this change to the avian flu, which ravaged the country's chicken populations, as well as to price increases and general economic stress. Yet, at the same time, the largest egg producer in the US saw a startling 718% increase in the first quarter income. This development sparked outrage and claims of price hikes. As a matter of fact, the risk of inflation is far beyond what meets the eye. Level of economic hardship will only cause further distress in a divided and socially unstable economy, and it may be finally the straw that snaps the fabled camel's back. But in all this, how will this phenomenon affect capitalism in the United States? Capitalism in the US is an all-encompassing force that has evolved into a kind of philosophy. Although it could appear to be an unavoidable force, everything about it was built over the course of hundreds of years. Nothing was by accident or natural selection. Today, one of the biggest corporations in the world is fighting a covert battle to turn liberal democracies into postmodern dictatorships. According to reports, the trend towards firms considering their obligations in terms of governance, social responsibility, and environmental factors in addition to profit maximization is at the core of this corporate-led communist era. The Trump administration proposed a rule for 2020 that would force pension funds to prioritize financial interests over non-financial ones, making them prioritize short-term income over long-term social and environmental sustainability. This policy was changed by the Biden administration, but recently, the US House enacted a bill to undo that change, with the backing of 2 Senate Democrats. The bill was then overturned by Biden using his veto, which was the first of his presidency. Environmental and social governance is most likely going to be a significant political topic in the 2024 presidential election. Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, which is dominated by Republicans, has accused Biden of wanting Wall Street to utilize tax-paying dollars to support a far-left political agenda. The notion that company owners have duties to society at large is not new. The modern corporate form first started to take shape in the 17th century thanks to innovations like joint stock holdings and the legal right to limited liability. It's possible to trace the beginnings of social responsibility of companies and ethical investment back centuries ago. This is very typical of organizations driven by religious principles. These concepts have been commonplace in business for many years. The claim is consistent with the Biden administration's emphasis on the negative effects of an economic monopoly. The proposal has gained traction among congressional Democrats, who have introduced legislation that would either outright outlaw high pricing or temporarily tax corporations' extra earnings if they charge prices they perceive to be unreasonable. These initiatives are mocked by opponents as being founded on a thin justification and a conspiracy theory, including the biggest corporate lobby in the country. What exactly is happening? Traditional macroeconomic theory may find it difficult to explain a pandemic, a trade war, a land war, massive government spending, and a greatly linked global economy. But when thinking about greedflation, the big question that needs to be asked is, are businesses overcharging customers to compensate for their rising costs? A global strategy economist at Societe Generale, Albert Edwards, stated on Twitter that businesses that exploit customers by raising prices in order to increase profits are the primary cause of rising inflation. Albert Edwards recently published a scathing article on the phenomenon known as greedflation. According to Edwards, customers accept price increases because they read about inflation in the news. However, businesses have basically taken advantage of escalating inflation expectations by raising prices while keeping costs the same and boosting their bottom line. Reports confirmed from the end of 2020 to the third quarter of 2022, many employee salaries increased by 14%, but corporate profits surged by a staggering 28% over that same period. Lastly, businesses have increased margins. More notably, they keep doing so even as the cost of their basic materials declines. As a matter of fact, businesses in affluent nations like the US and the UK have used the rise in material costs brought on by the pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine as a reason to raise rates and boost profit margins. The French investment bank is not just noteworthy historically, it is also one of the few institutions that the Financial Stability Board has designated as having systemic importance. In addition, Edwards stated in one edition of his Global Strategy Weekly that despite his 4 decades of experience in financial industry, he has never witnessed corporate greed levels this high throughout the economic cycle. After dealing in finance for 40 years, Edwards said that he has never witnessed anything comparable to the unprecedented and astonishing levels of corporate greedflation in this economic cycle. To support his claim, a study released in January by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City revealed that markup growth, or the rise in the proportion of a company's pricing to its cost of production, was a much more significant component driving inflation in 2021 than it had ever been. Generally speaking, rising labor expenses and commodity prices reduce company profit margins, particularly if the economy is faltering. Eventually, Edwards cited Bureau of Economic Analysis stats that were made public last week and indicated that profit margins versus costs were still very close to records in the fourth quarter. According to the analyst, he predicted that as the economy weakened at the end of last year, margins would have declined drastically. If consumers keep having trouble with inflation, Edwards says he worries that the supernormal profit margins of businesses, both domestically and abroad, will eventually inflame societal discontent. But then, Edwards' comment may eventually play a crucial role in popularizing a perspective that has previously existed on the progressive periphery. He put out a contentious remedy to address the greedflation problem, which he claimed reflected his weakening confidence in the capitalist system. At one point, he claimed that there is an instrument for this type of issue, and it's from the same decade. price controls. This statement was previously unthinkable to those of us who survived the flawed price levels and income policies of the 1970s. From the collapse of the First Babylonian Kingdom in 1595 BC to the lengthy queues at the gas pump during the Nixon and Carter administrations in the 70s, price controls, or when a government regulates the rates businesses are permitted to charge customers, have been attributed to a variety of events. Going back to history, the Roman emperor who established a decree on optimum prices for labor, goods, and more in order to curb raging inflation in AD 301 is the source of one of the most popular myths regarding the purported foolishness of price limits. However, the edict, which carried the death penalty for violators, ultimately backfired, leading to a shortage of products and its dependency on government wheat, which eventually resulted in its removal. Because of this background, Edwards found that many of his contemporaries were less responsive to the use of price restrictions, but he contends that their application may be necessary because something appears to have gone wrong with capitalism, and this is becoming evident even in the major banks in the US. The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank earlier this year caused waves of panic throughout the financial system and sparked a domino effect of chaos that financial companies are still attempting to control. The collapse of the second and third largest banks in US history is currently being investigated to determine what must have happened and how to avoid it. Is this a crisis that has been exaggerated by social media, or has it revealed flaws in the financial system like the 2008 bank failures? We can generally agree that Silicon Valley Bank was properly governed and did not cause its downfall by engaging in dangerous financial speculation. Instead, we can attribute the failure to shifting economic conditions, including hefty government spending that caused inflation and raised interest rates. However, some people blame economic causes for the failure, arguing that it was severely impacted by the recent decline in technology stocks. In the end, slapping customers with exponentially increasing interest rates is an inadequate tactic to combat the inflation of company margins. And it generally looks like inflation is just corporate greed in disguise. But when will the authorities put a stop to these price hikes?